In this video, I'm going to talk about how to hardwire radar detectors and dash cameras. And while the process for hardwiring both of them is similar, it is not the same. Now you can use some of the same wiring if you're putting both in your car, but there is a few differences between a dash camera and a radar detector that you need to know. First off, most radar detectors run off 12 volts. Okay? Your car's electrical system is 12 volts, which means a radar detector can be hooked directly to your car's electrical system with no adapters, and it'll power up and run. A dash camera is different. Most dash cameras run off 5 volts, and it's usually in the form of USB. 5 volts. So if you hooked up a dash camera directly into your car's electrical system, you would blow up the dash camera. The dash camera must be powered by 5 volts, and so you're going to need to take a 12 volt to 5 volt adapter in order to be able to power your dash camera. In fact, a USB cigarette lighter adapter is nothing more than a 12 volt to 5 volt adapter. So we will use something similar and wire it under the dashboard in order to power the dash camera. This is a hardwire kit for a dash camera. And if you look on the back here, you can see that, let's see here. You can see it says it takes 12 volts to 24 volts in and puts out 5 volts. So this box takes the car's 12 volt system and puts out 5 volts, and in this case 5 volts through a micro USB, which in turn fits the dash camera, and this then powers the dash camera. So now that you know that we're going to need slightly different wiring for these two items, there's one other thing you need to know about. It's called switched power. What is switched power? Switched power is when you turn on the car's ignition, switched power turns on, and when you turn off the car's ignition, switched power turns off. Basically, it's 12 volt power that turns on and off with the key. And that is the kind of power we want to use to power the radar detector and the dash camera, because we want them to turn on when we turn on the key and turn off when we turn off the key. Your car's electrical system has constant power as well, where the 12 volts is on whether the car is turned on or not turned on. But you don't want to use that, because then these will always be on even when the car is turned off, and that'll just run down your car's battery. So we always want to use switched power when we power radar detectors and dash cameras. So how do we wire these? Well, there are different ways, but probably the easiest and safest way of doing it is to use a tapper fuse. This is a tapper fuse, and what it does is you go into the fuse box of your car, and you pull out a fuse. You push this in place of that fuse, and then this basically provides a 12 volt power from your fuse box that we can then use this to power our electronics. So this is the neatest and cleanest way of hardwiring electronics. Even if you buy a kit like this, these kits still have, just a positive and negative wire that you have to wire up somewhere. And the tapper fuse allows you to connect the positive to this wire here, and that will give you your 12 volts to power your electronics. Notice that this only has one wire. So you might be saying to yourself, well, where do I put the negative? The whole body of your car is negative. They actually run the negative current of cars through the entire metal bodywork. So all you have to do is put the negative to any bolt under the dashboard that you can find that screws into the metal, and that will be a negative. So the body of the entire car is negative, so you just attach this to anywhere under the car that where there's an easy bolt that you can get to and attach this to, and that'll be negative. And then the positive will go through the tapper fuse into your fuse box, and that is where you'll get your positive from. And again, that is going into, then, once we wired that in, that'll run through this adapter, which will turn the 12 volts into 5 volts, and that'll come out here and power the dash camera. For the radar detector, we are still going to use the tapper fuse and the negative off the ground, but we don't need an adapter. This 12 volts is what the radar detector needs already. So you literally just take some wire from this all the way right into the dash camera like this. Right into the radar detector like this. And with no adapter, plugging the 12 volts right into your radar detector will power your radar detector with no adapter. So we will, and maybe you're saying to yourself, well, do we need 2 tapper fuses for 2 of these? No. Just use 1 tapper fuse, but maybe have 2 wires coming out of here, one for the radar detector and one for the dash camera. Now I'm going to go show you around some of my cars, and we will talk about exactly how I've wired some of these things and how to do some of these things. Okay, so we are inside my work car, and most cars have a fuse box underneath the steering wheel. This is the steering wheel up here, just so you know where we are. Most cars have a fuse box either underneath the steering wheel here or on the side of the car here by the door jamb. Anyways, you're going to want to go find that fuse box, pop off the cover, and then you're going to see a bunch of fuses in here. And you can actually see my tapper fuse is already installed because this car is already wired with a hardwired kit. But you are going to want to decide which fuse you want to install the tapper fuse in. You can install it in any one of these fuses, but you shouldn't install it in any one of these fuses. You need to find a very specific fuse. You want to find a fuse for something that turns on. Think about things in your car that turn on with the car and turn off with the car. Things like the radio, things like the cigarette lighter. So those are the kind of things you're going to want to tap, or that's where you want to install your tapper fuse on, is something that normally turns on with the car and turns off with the car. So like I said, radio, cigarette lighter, mostly the cigarette lighter, those are the most obvious. So here is the fuse panel for my car. Line it up and make sure that you line it up so that the diagram looks the same and is in the same orientation as your fuse box. And you can see I have tapped the second from the bottom. Well, second from the bottom, power outlet. That is the cigarette lighter. So I have tapped my cigarette lighter for my tapper fuse. So that is where I installed my tapper fuse. You just pull out the fuse. You can see there's no fuse in there. You pull out the fuse. The fuse you take out, you actually install it in the tapper fuse. The tapper fuse has 2 fuses, one for the circuit there and one for the dash camera and radar detector that you're trying to power. So the fuse you pull out of there, you actually install it in the tapper fuse. The tapper fuse will already have one of the fuses installed. And now with both fuses installed, you can just push the tapper fuse back in its spot like that. And now this wire here has 12 volts to it. Then this wire goes to back here where I shoved a bunch of the wiring for the radar detector and the dash camera, and I'll actually pull that out right now so we can have a look at it. Okay, let's resume some of the wiring. So you can see I have a red and black wire here. This red comes directly from the tapper fuse that's up here, and this should be switched 12 volts. This black actually just goes and attaches to a bolt that is underneath the dash. That is a ground bolt. Let me see if I can move the camera and we can try and see. Excuse me while we have a look. There you can see the black wire up there with the yellow crimp. That is a ground bolt, and that is a bolt that just goes into the body of the car. And so that, like I said, the whole body is negative, so that bolt now is a negative connection. Let's put the camera back here. Okay, so we have our positive and we have our negative. Now, you should double check that this is a switched positive. How do you do that? Well, you take a multimeter and you connect the one side, you connect the negative to the negative and the positive to the positive, and put the multimeter in voltage mode. And right now you can see we have no voltage. That's 1.5 millivolts. That's your body produces that kind of voltage. So there is no voltage right now from these leads. These leads are not hot. But if I start the car, let me try and do this all with one hand here and turn the ignition. If I turn the ignition on the car, 12 volts. So now we know that these leads deliver 12 volts when the car turns on, and there's no voltage when the car turns off. So I have my positive and I have my negative. Now what am I going to plug into those things? Okay, this is the positive and negative wire to the dash cam adapter box that I showed you earlier. So this will feed the 5 volts to the dash camera. So I need to hook up the red to the red and the black to the black. I also have this wire which goes to my radar detector, and white with a stripe on it is negative, and white without a stripe on is positive. So this is, so I got a positive and negative wire here too, and I need to hook these up as well. So actually I'm going to hook them up together. Okay, so the way you do this is I take my positive here, and I know that this is positive here, and I'm going to wrap these together so that I've joined the two positives, and I am going to take my connector that fits that, slide it on, and then crimp it. It's not the tightest crimp I've ever done. Let me give that an extra little more crimp. Okay, that's a pretty good crimp. Now I'm going to take the negative and the negative, and I'm going to twist these two together. Slide this connector on and give it a good crimp. Let me give it a little extra crimp. Okay, so now one is negative, one is positive. We carefully plug the positive into the positive, and where's that negative go? Okay, we plug the negative into the negative. Okay, now we have power going to the radar detector and the dash camera. Now let me show you around a little bit more. So where do those wires go? Those wires come up here. Okay, one you can see goes over to the dash camera, and one runs up behind this panel and comes over to my dash camera over here. So remember, this wire is getting 12 volts direct, and this wire ran through that adapter box to turn it down to 5 volts before it went into the dash camera. if you have one of these panels, to run the wire through the dash, you will have to pop this panel. Be careful. A lot of cars have airbags in these panels, so it's actually a good idea to disconnect the negative of the battery before you pull this panel, so that you don't accidentally set off the airbag. But these panels all pop off really easily. Literally, you just slide a screwdriver or a trim tool in here, and you can pop the panel off. There you go. See, panel pops off, and then you can lift it out and tuck all your wires behind it. And then when you're done, and this is actually the microphone for my radio system, sorry, some shaky handwork here. That goes back on there. And when you're done, you just sort of clip the panel back on. But anyways, that's how you get your wires through the dashboard and out onto here. But now that I've hooked up those wires down there, these items should all turn on when I turn on the ignition. So let me find the keys, and we will turn on the ignition. Dash camera is, nope, the radar detector is on, and the dash camera is on. So there you go. We now have power to both the dash camera and the radar detector. Just remember that the radar detector doesn't need an adapter, it just needs 12 volts direct. And the dash camera does need an adapter. It needs a 5 volt adapter, so that power needs to be run through a 5 volt to USB adapter. There is one other alternative method of wiring up dash cameras and radar detectors. It is for more advanced users, and you need to be comfortable using a multimeter. But most modern cars have one of these sort of panels above the mirror, and even the mirror, where there is lights, sunroofs, home link buttons, which means that there is 12 volts sitting behind this panel. And there's things that work and turn on and turn off with the car, like the sunroof. Most sunroofs you can't open when the car is turned off. A lot of the home link buttons don't work when the car is turned off. So that means that there is switched 12 volts behind this panel. So if you don't feel like pulling this panel down and running wiring from the back, from underneath, you can pop the roof panel down, find the wiring harness for this panel, use your multimeter to find which wires are the switched 12 volt wires. And often you can find schematics online to figure out which wire colors are switched 12 volts. Find the ground wire, find the switched 12 volt wire. And then you could actually put all your wiring, the USB adapter for the dash camera, everything actually up in here in the roof liner behind this panel, and then just have a single wire coming out from underneath the headliner down to your dash camera or your radar detector. This is a very clean way of doing it, but it is far more advanced because you're going to have to tap the wiring behind this panel, and you're going to have to use wire taps. And it's not going to be fused like the tapper fuse did off the fuse box. So for beginners, I recommend using the tapper fuse and running the wires from the fuse box. For more advanced users, don't be afraid to look for switched 12 volt power up in the headliner and use that as your source of power for your radar detector and your dash camera.